You're listening to Accounted For, the Canadian podcast that explores the intangibles of every career. I'm your host, Daniel Lee. Hello. Hope you're all having a happy Wednesday. Today on the Accounted For podcast is Matt O'Leary. Matt is the Chief Partnership Officer at Carrott Rewards. Carrott Rewards is an app that helps people meet their personal health and fitness goals using kind of like a habit-based reward system. And it also kind of has a play and loyalty points as well. And Carrott Rewards is a Toronto-based company. And Matt truly has had what I would consider an international career journey, where he started in PR, like so public relations and lobbying in London, United Kingdom, London, and then moving over to Singapore, then creating a venture lab for the billionaire AirAsia founder and ex-Virgin executive Tony Fernandes in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, until he finally returned home to Canada to continue his journey in the startup ecosystem by focusing on like biz dev roles. And we actually also go through just what biz dev is, because I've personally had a constant confusion with sales versus biz dev versus partnerships. And so we talk about that. And we also talk about how his lobbying for international government organizations and his product management experience at AirAsia led to how he leads the partnership role at Carrott today. And this just seems like such a well planned out career path, but obviously this was not what Matt really had intended. And we just dig into his adventure today. So, take a break to listen to this awesome story of Matt O'Leary. And before I send you off to listen to the story, just wanted to remind you to support the podcast by rating it 5 stars on iTunes, and also if you could leave a positive, helpful review of how the podcast may have helped you and impacted your life in a positive way, that would definitely be helpful. And look forward to getting your name shouted out in a future episode. All right, thanks, and please enjoy the episode with Matt O'Leary. Hey everyone, welcome back to Accounted For. Today on the podcast we have Matt O'Leary from Carrott Rewards. Hey Matt, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Matt here is the Chief Partnership Officer at Carrott Rewards. And so Matt, to begin off, do you mind explaining to our listeners what Carrott Rewards does?
Yeah, so it's really simple. Carrott Rewards is a mobile app that rewards you with your favorite loyalty points for learning more about your health to increase your knowledge and confidence, as well as rewarding you for meeting daily step goals.
And is this a Canada-wide app?
So right now we're only available in 3 provinces, Ontario, BC, and Newfoundland. So, the joke I always make is 2 provinces in a town, but we have actually 1 million registered users just in those 3 provinces.
Oh, wow.
And we'll be going national in January.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's we've only been in market for 2.5 years, so we're pretty proud of it.
Yeah, no, definitely, and hopefully this helps reach a wider audience, and our listeners can also get involved as well.
Yeah.
And so to begin off, I kind of want to go back to your earlier days, and you told me that from a previous conversation that you grew up around here in Markham.
Yep.
And you were very, I guess, athletic growing up. You played a lot of different sports.
Yeah, I would say that I played a lot of different sports. I don't know what that means in terms of athletic, but I grew up in Markham, Ontario. Had a really idyllic upbringing. I have a twin sister, a sister who's 17 months younger. Amazing parents, and I guess they'd always, tried to motivate us to be kind of active. Physically, also just kind of, they had high expectations and a lot of, I guess, hope for us, and yeah.
And so were you like the typical Canadian who wanted to be a professional ice hockey player when you were 7?
I actually wasn't. So because there was 3 of us that were 17 months apart, my dad found a sport for us that wouldn't involve him being in a hockey rink at 5 in the morning sipping coffee. So we grew up ski racing. It was a really easy way for him, I think, and both of my parents to kind of pass us off on the weekends to our ski instructors and get some time to themselves. And, it's an amazing family sport.
Wow. Was it like Nordic skiing or cross country?
Downhill skiing.
Downhill?
Which you would know being from Vancouver.
Yeah. We had a ski team back when I was in high school, so I've seen a couple of videos of that. But yeah.
You didn't ski yourself?
I did. I skied. So I started skiing. We have Cyprus, so I was fortunate enough to start skiing early. And then it was not really that cool when you're in high school, so I did snowboarding. And then I broke my face in the first year, then my wrist the second, and my collarbone the third. And so now I just don't bother snowboarding anymore.
Snowboarding's tough because you fall on your wrists,
Yeah.
I broke most bones actually in every sport that I played. But skiing is something that you can do till your 80s, so I'm glad I have that base.
No, that's true. I think if I ever do go back to winter sports, I might go back to skiing. It's just safer for my knees as well, I think, after my surgery.
Yeah.
Cool. So you grew up in Markham, and so you went to school at Queen's. Like if we looked at your LinkedIn profile, you did political studies in Queen's, and then you decided to leave the country and go to London to do some international studies, and your career continues on in London. Why did you go over to the UK?
So my dad was actually born in London, with my last name being O'Leary. We're obviously of Irish heritage, but after World War II, where my grandfather was a member of the British Navy, he ended up settling in London, where my dad was born. He ended up coming and immigrating to Canada. And because of that, I have a British passport. I think that I'd actually give Queen's credit for this. The idea of being able to just go and explore the world was something that was really common amongst the friends and classmates that I had at Queen's. Oh. And so I always just knew that I was going to leverage the fact that I could live in another country. And I knew that from the moment that I entered Queen's, and I had a fantastic time, and ended up going over there to do my master's studies. And of course, it was easier because I was a British citizen.
Yeah, and why international studies?
So I originally wanted to be a diplomat. That was how my career started. So I studied politics at Queen's, and I was interested in the things that actually I've applied since in my business career, which is the ideas of negotiation and how do you bring a lot of people on side. Those are skills that you have to leverage as an entrepreneur. And the school that I chose to go to, the School of Oriental and African Studies, had a very strong diplomacy program. And so that was the whole kind of impetus behind it. But you didn't go down the diplomat route.
No. You joined Brunswick Group, and if I'm correct, it's kind of like is that like a lobbying company, or is it?
So they have a public affairs firm, portion of their business, but what they are is a strategic communications firm. So what they end up doing is that if you have a big cross-border M&A transaction, there are a lot of things that can affect the outcome of the deal. One of the biggest things is how the communications are done towards the analyst community on the capital market side, as well as the press. And so that's where the public affairs kind of government lobbying angle comes in. It was a really interesting firm, highly regarded in the UK. Have since massively expanding globally. But yeah, that was an interesting story how I ended up there, which was I did a summer in 2007 as a banking analyst at Standard Chartered Bank.
Oh, so like investment banking.
Yeah, that was, it was a time from 2003 to 2007 when, if you put on a half decent suit in London, you were going to get hired at a bank, and it was an incredibly frothy time in terms of a market to be in that, and then of course the bottom ended up coming out. And so the analyst program that I was in ended up not taking on any more students for that year. I was kind of stuck in London without a job and ended up answering this ad and got the job at Brunswick Group.
Okay. What made you not want to pursue that diplomat route that you had so eagerly thought about?
It's too slow. I think that the idea of it, as I learned more about it, I realized that I was more interested in the idea of being a diplomat, which is a fascinating career. It's competitive to get into. You have to kind of pay your dues, and I was too impatient for all of that. I realized I was much more suited and more built towards a career in business.
Yeah, so it's more the process of, I guess, the activities of a diplomat that interested you, not so much the title itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the title did too. It's a prestigious job, and just being honest about it. And the activity piece really is that you're not having to use your brain that much. You are largely just communicating, and regurgitating is the wrong word, but just communicating whatever you're told from your government. And I wanted to do something that was a bit more creative.
And so you went to join a strategic communications firm, and you continued on. So it's relatively similar path. Like you joined another firm after that called Creed that does like public relations.
So the firm I actually joined is a company called Gavin Anderson. We were then bought by a company called Creab.
Oh, okay.
Creab, yeah.
Hard name.
It is. It's Swedish. So it's a Swedish-based company that is the largest lobbying firm in the EU, so towards the European Parliament. And that was a really fascinating company to join, especially at that time. It was the first time I'd ever been through and got to do that early in my career. An acquisition kind of, and had to figure out how to integrate with our new owners. And that was a fascinating time.
And what does a lobbyist do?
Just like goes for really nice dinners, lunch and coffee and networking. It's what I was doing specifically at that time was really trying to understand how the press was influencing. We did a lot of crisis management. So the big project that I worked on at that time was there was a financial crisis in Europe, and we were representing the government of Portugal and their efforts to try to communicate to an international audience that they were doing well economically. And so coming up with the strategies about how they communicated their positions to the press, how they communicated towards the European Union, that's what we helped with.
Were they in a good economical position?
I mean, no. But I think that the whole idea of being able to, no one really was then, in particular Portugal and Greece and Spain. But trying to help them craft their story, craft their narrative, was something that we did.
Gotcha. And for these kind of public relations companies, where does your involvement and start and is it, so you come in, I guess, during the crisis, and then do you just draft up like, you should say this, and then you leave it up to them after that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think with anybody at the level that we were certainly dealing at, so, we had, that was the big project that I worked on, but we worked with, companies there were FTSE 250 companies and their CEOs and their executive teams. And really, and I kind of will get to the point about how I thought about that position. It was interesting to have that kind of exposure, but you were just an advisor. So you could offer advice, but ultimately you weren't responsible for the execution of it. And the people who sat in those seats were the ones that were making the decisions. So they would take our advice and they would incorporate it. But they did not have, they were going to do whatever they wanted to, And I always felt that being in an advisory service is, it's a necessity, and there's many different types of advisors. But sitting in that role for about 4 years made me realize I wanted to be on the other side of the coin. I wanted to have more skin in the game. And
did you realize that while you were in London, or was this when you now transitioned over to Singapore, now a new continent?
I think I'd realized it really early on. I think anybody wants to find meaning in their work, and people want to have agency over what they're doing. And the thing about advisory services that I realized at the time was that there was going to be a limit to where that could, kind of net out, and how much influence you could actually have. And so I'd had that thought in London, but I also still had always known that I wanted to use a career to help me go and see the world. So that I think is always set up as a dichotomous thing, that you want to travel and go explore, or you want to settle down and have a career. And I always, from the outset, when I left Queens and moved to London, saw that you could do both. You could build a career while also, getting to travel and explore and see the world.
Mm-hmm. And London, we talked about how your father is English, and so he had a passport, and
he's Irish, but he was born in England.
Sorry, Irish, but born in England.
He'll definitely want me to say that.
My apologies. I actually went to a British school when I was in elementary school, so I was kind of educated in the
Vancouver?
differences. No, in Hong Kong. So
I
was born in South Korea, then I moved to Hong Kong, but that was 1997, so the Brits just left, but I still attended a school that was run by the Brits there. So I think one teacher was from Scotland, one was from actually England, and so they kind of educated me in the difference because they'd have their internal squabbles. But regardless. But Singapore, where's a connection there? Why did you want to go over to Singapore now from?
It was really opportunistic. I got offered after working on this project that we were doing with Portugal from the CEO of the company to kind of transfer to the Singapore office. I'd never been to Singapore, so I took the transfer without ever having actually been to the country. I was, I think, 26 at the time, so I just had two bags that were filled up all my belongings and kind of got on a flight and went.
And so now you go to Singapore, but you're still with the same company and you're doing the same thing.
Company, yeah.
And then after that, you, like you said, you didn't want to be an agent anymore or an advisor anymore, and so transitioned over to be eventually you become the head of product management at AirAsia in Kuala Lumpur.
Quite the jump.
Yeah, how kind of connected to me for me there. You go from being a lobbyist to being the head of product management.
Yeah. So I moved to Singapore in October of 2010, and at that time, the world in the West, anyways, was still recovering from the 2008 recession, or not even recovering yet. It still felt like this was Armageddon, and there seemed to be a huge move in terms of opportunity in going east. So there was just a lot of companies that were looking to the rising countries, of course, China and India, but also in Southeast Asia. And so I ended up there, and I was working, and the firm that I was with, Carrott, their office in Singapore did primarily investor relations work. That was really straightforward, not that interesting. I'd always been interested in technology. I, had worked with technology companies as clients, and just kind of taught myself and learned things on the side. And an opportunity came up. So a friend of mine and I, still a very, very close friend of mine, he got to know a billionaire in Asia, Tony Fernandes, who founded AirAsia. Tony's a fascinating guy, one of the world's great entrepreneurs. He ended up founding AirAsia after working for Richard Branson in the 1980s at Virgin Music, and then kind of took that whole idea, that Virgin idea of branded venture capitalism, and kind of ripped it off wholesale and applied it in a Southeast Asian context. So if you see the AirAsia logo, it looks a lot like the Virgin logo. Have you seen it?
I have. I've actually been on a AirAsia flight.
Okay.
And it's definitely a discount. It reminds me of Ryanair. I think that's a similar one.
Yeah, it is definitely a discount. So he started with that airline. He bought one plane from the Malaysian government in 2001. It was 1 ringgit and 10 million in debt. Ended up turning that into the black, and within 2 years, and listed the company, and then built this conglomerate that had hotels and telecoms, and he owned an F1 team at the time when we were working with him, Queens Park Rangers in the English Premiership League. Just a really incredible entrepreneur. And so Aaron had pitched him on starting this venture group that was going to be attached to the airline that we were going to spin out into a different business. And that group was going to do two things, which was leverage the existing assets that, or a number of assets that were in this kind of group of businesses to build technology products for them. And the other one was to do technology partnerships with startups. And so, Aaron and I kind of met. I took on this job, kind of trial by fire of jumping into a product management role, and I'd never done that before. And that whole idea, especially when you're in your 20s, of wanting to try a number of different careers, going from being a lobbyist in the UK to being a product leader, seems like a huge gulf. And I just it ended up not being. It ended up being an amazing experience of being able to learn and kind of apply things in a whole new way in a new environment.
And how did the pitching process go? So Tony Fernandes has his Air Asia conglomerate, and so you and your friend Aaron did you guys just cold call him and set up a meeting?
So Aaron actually worked at BlackBerry at the time, and Tony was a big client of BlackBerry's, and he managed the relationship. And Tony had this thing, and he still has it, where he really hires people for hunger and for motivation to learn. And it's not about aptitude. His thing that he always talked about is that you can see, the fire in someone's eyes or feel if they're passionate. And skills can be taught and skills can be learned, but that's something that's really hard to teach. Do you have somebody who has that kind of fire to grow and to learn? And so he took a swing on Aaron, and Aaron brought me into the fold, and it was an amazing 2 years. An amazing 2 years in the sense that we shared an apartment together in Kuala Lumpur. So I moved from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur.
And Aaron was already in Kuala Lumpur at the time? Gotcha.
Aaron was already in Kuala Lumpur at the time. I moved in with him and his girlfriend, so close living quarters, and it was everything that you think about when you think of a startup. We had a huge whiteboard in our living room. We'd wake up at 3 a.m. and be plotting things out, and it was a really incredible time.
And I think this seems like a very relatively unique setup where you have a startup, but you essentially joined, I guess, a bigger conglomerate itself, and practically Tony's trusting you guys to create this big incubator lab like venture company. Yeah. And so he's just kind of funding you guys and saying, hey, here's a time limit, try to start it up and make it into business.
Yeah, so that was really it. It was getting to be an entrepreneur with a lot of resources. Well, as you'd already mentioned, it is a budget airline, so this wasn't a ton of funds, and being cost conscious and frugal was one of the values of the airline, but it certainly was a great opportunity to be able to access a number of different businesses that kind of had a built-in client base for us to start from.
And how was the build-up of the actual fund itself? Like, did you guys see success relatively quick?
So we did. So what the biggest product that we built was the airline's booking engine, which had like 4 million downloads in Southeast Asia. Their mobile booking engine, sorry. I think did $100 million in bookings per year. I think that's dollars, not ringgit. And then we just kind of tried a bunch of other things. So the team ended up growing at the beginning from about 6 people into 30 people. We had a number of different projects going, none that really hit like that core one. But again, we were in an okay spot to do that because we had support from the mothership.
Right. Mm-hmm. And this kind of like booking software that you guys built, like this mobile app that you guys built up, did it just come from a lot of different A/B testings? You guys just thought, okay, what can we do to help the airline, and what are all the different problems we could solve?
So this would have been in 2012, and what you were seeing there at that time was an interesting thing where people were skipping the stage of owning a laptop, and they were skipping the web and they were jumping right to mobile. And at that time as well, BlackBerry still had a huge market penetration in Southeast Asia. iPhones were not that rare, but there weren't a ton of them. And then Android had a huge share of the market. And so being able to go to this kind of mobile first market and build a product just made sense to us. And so that was the one big thing that we built. We launched a couple other things that we had. We launched at the time it was when Groupon was taking off, so we launched a group booking website that absolutely flopped about how to take some of the leftover inventory from the airplane and offer these group deals. That didn't work. But it was an amazing experience to learn about how to run and build a product team, and how to learn how to kind of iterate that whole idea of the lean startup, which is building things quickly and testing them in market and getting real time feedback. That was where I learned that, and that's a way of thinking, that can affect a lot of areas of your life, which is this growth mindset about how you're constantly learning.
Mm-hmm. And you don't have a technical background. You're not an
No,
engineer.
I don't.
And was Aaron the technical background?
So he wasn't an engineer; he was a physicist. So he had a technical background, but he did not have a computer engineering background.
Gotcha. So did you guys end up using the funds to really just focus on hiring a tech team
So
to build out the idea?
Yeah, so we had like a budget, is the way to think about it, as opposed to funds. We had a CTO who's incredible. He actually ended up going on now to lead mobile at Grab Taxi, which is Southeast Asia's answer to Uber.
Right. Yeah.
That was actually an interesting story. So they came to us and asked us to do a partnership, and there was 5 of them in an office. This is a company now that is worth billions and billions of dollars, at least on paper. And they wanted to install their technology in taxis and be able to pick people up at the airport. And so we did this first partnership, and Aaron and I, considered, how we can invest, and ended up not doing it. And I think everybody has one of those stories about where you miss a big opportunity. But yeah, it's so there was actually an incredible team and an incredible amount of talent that we were able to find there, that we ended up turning into this this kind of ragtag group called so it was called AirAsia Tech and Innovation, and it was then spun out and became a company that still exists called Tune Labs.
Tune Labs, gotcha. And you didn't end up staying with that team. You ended up coming back to Toronto and ended up taking a position at Extreme Labs, which ended up getting bought up by Pivotal, and the role changed to more of it seems like a sales capacity. So how did that transpire?
So my 4th job change already.
Yeah, so we were lobbyists, and I think this is now back to, I guess, the home continent. You've been to 3 continents now, and I decided to come home. Yeah,
so I'd been gone at that point for almost 7.5 years. As I said at the beginning, you wouldn't think of it because I'd been moving farther and farther away from them, but I'm incredibly close with my family. My twin sister had just gotten married, and I was back in town. So this would have been in May of 2013, and I ended up meeting someone. I was back for a wedding. Ended up meeting a friend of a friend who was a senior business development guy at Extreme Labs, and ended up kind of going through the interview process. I started it here, but ended up doing it almost exclusively via Skype while I was back in Kuala Lumpur, and ended up getting an offer. And I'd kind of seen that where my role with Tune Labs had reached a natural end, and that this was a good opportunity to go home and kind of join and become a part of the Toronto startup ecosystem.
And Extreme Labs, is the business model similar to Tune Labs? The labs sound the same.
Yeah, so Tune Labs, really what we were, there's lots of different places in that market, but we were a development services company, and that's what Extreme Labs was. Extreme Labs' differentiator was that they were exclusively focused on mobile, really before anybody else was. So it was started by Amar Varma, who ended up becoming my boss, and he the idea was, how do you build a software development firm doing this really early? This was 2008 or 2009. That's going to be only focused on mobile products. And so for a time up until the acquisition, they were really the leader of any development company in North America for building mobile products.
Mm-hmm. And Extreme gets bought up by Pivotal, so it's now your second time you're going through an acquisition.
Yeah.
And so you must be accustomed to it now. And
I don't know about accustomed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I had a better idea what to prepare for.
Right, so you did. And last time we talked, you talked about how in this kind of sales role that the money was great, but the role itself wasn't what you really enjoyed too particularly much.
Yeah, so I was on a team of there was about 10 of us that were whatever you want to call it, client director, account executive. We were quota-carrying salespeople. It was really fun. I learned a lot of things. I have some great friends still from the Extreme Labs and Pivotal Labs, which is what Extreme Labs ended up becoming within Pivotal. Friends from there and colleagues, and it's an amazing alumni network of people. But I guess I looked at it and realized that I was actually in the right spot. So, being in business development, which applies an ability to be able to understand product as well as understanding the business side, how do you drive revenue out of that, was a more natural fit for me. I also missed the startup world, where you're just kind of at a different phase in the company, where you're ideating and you're trying to make things work, and you're at that real kind of 0 to 1 phase, whereas Pivotal had been a business that was spun out of EMC, which is a big data storage company based in Boston, and they'd kind of glued all these parts together. They ended up creating a really successful business as a platform as a service. Cloud Foundry is their product, but that just wasn't something that I was passionate about or what I'd sign up for. That was there was aspects of the role where I learned a ton on, but I miss startups.
Yeah, and we're seeing this continuous, iteration that you're making continuously small changes to perfect, the model. And now
some were big changes,
right?
Guess.
Yeah, some were big enough changes where you made enough of a shift, and it seems that in the beginning there were the big changes, and now you've kind of found your groove. And so, as you stated, you had that inkling to go back to that startup world, and so you eventually left Pivotal to join a startup. But in the similar position to lead up business development before you eventually joined Carrott Rewards. So how'd that startup experience go?
It was fine. It was, I knew that it was never going to be a long-term thing. The company doesn't exist anymore, as 90% of startups don't. I just, that first year that I was with Pivotal, I was spending, most weeks in New York, and the company was getting me to move there, and I'd been away for a really long time, and I'd just met and moved in with my now wife in Toronto, and so, I was not that interested in moving to New York. And so I ended up, leaving and kind of taking something on this was an incredibly early stage. I wouldn't even really be able to call it a company. It was kind of an ideation piece. And it was a good transition to kind of, get into the startup world and figure out where I wanted to be within it.
Gotcha. And when you say ideation phase, so was this company pre any sort of funding whatsoever?
There was a little bit of funding in the business, but definitely pre-revenue.
Gotcha.
And in a lot of ways, pre-product.
What made you want to go into something that was that early? Were you sold by the idea itself or the team?
I was sold by the idea. I was sold by the team. There was some people on that team who were great people. It wasn't in a space that I was that passionate about, and that's a normal thing. It was a big jump for me to go from where I was at Pivotal, which was a somewhat safe job, if not stressful, because you had targets to hit, to going and as I mentioned, getting back into that startup roots about how do you ideate, how do you think about where you're going to grow a company. It was probably just a little bit too early for me, to be honest.
And how does Carrott come about now while you're in the startup?
So Carrott was founded by a gentleman named Andreas Suvaliotis. He was our CEO and founder. And the way that he founded the company is that he'd sold a business that did something similar to Air Miles, which is a big Canadian loyalty points program. And the whole idea was, that initial idea that he had was, how can you use the power of loyalty points to incentivize people to do good? And the specific area that he chose, this was in 2007, was how can you incentivize people to live a more environmentally friendly lifestyle? And so he ended up selling the business to Air Miles, and his main learning was that if you actually leverage the brand of these currencies, so there's, Canada's a loyalty obsessed country, who in these companies like Air Miles or Aeroplan, we're seeing have built huge user bases in the country. And so he started taking the power of Air Miles and applying it to things like getting people to buy more fresh produce at a grocery store, or incentivizing people with loyalty points to sign up to the YMCA. And these programs were performing incredibly well in terms of marketing spend against other forms of marketing that the government largely was using. And so the Public Health Agency of Canada had this program where they were partnering with private sector organizations and really any organization that wasn't the government to help them deliver on mandates that they didn't think they'd be able to deliver on. And so Andreas and some of his former colleagues answered, and delivered this proposal that ended up getting accepted. So after it got accepted, he had to build a team, and he brought on Sarah Richard, who's our Chief Product Officer, Dr. Mark Mitchell, who's our our principal behavioral science advisor, and me to run partnerships and revenue. And that at that time meant, we had this initial kind of funding grant from the government, and we were going to build a business around that.
Gotcha. And was this much more aligned to an area that you would be more passionate about? Like, how did you make the decision to say, this is the one, I'm going to join it?
You know what it was really is that I think that everybody is, certainly of certain generations, is motivated by wanting to do some good in some way, shape, or form. And I think back to my earlier academic life, and you're trying to understand how, in what medium, in what way you're going to be able to do that. And I had always kind of come to the point that business is the best tool, the best means with which to have an impact. And just having this combine all of those things together, with the idea that more good meant more profit, and that we can build a company off of that, was really exciting.
Yeah, I think I had a similar realization a few months ago. I think one book that was really helpful was Richard Branson's biography, Losing My Virginity.
Mm-hmm.
He's done a lot of good for the world, and he's tried partnering with the government and doing it, or running a company and doing it, and the latter has worked much better for him. And I also caught up with a colleague who left the consulting world after long periods, and we joined the government to advise. And unfortunately, the person confirmed that, I'm probably going to leave, and if I want to do some good, you're probably better off joining a private enterprise or public stock market enterprise or whatnot, to try to make the change happen, just because he was just really disillusioned by what you could do or could not do, really, when you joined the government.
Yeah, and I think it's even more complicated than that. You have to find a way to get all different sectors of society working together if you want to have an impact. And that's something that we've done with varying degrees of success. It's certainly not an easy thing, but kind of sitting in this place where we have the nimbleness and the agile structure of a private company, of a startup company, but working with these huge government partners and corporate partners, and kind of sitting in the middle of all that I think is the sweet spot. It's the Venn diagram of where you're going to end up having the most impact.
Yeah, I agree. I think Carrott definitely presents a unique business model that actually works quite well with the kind of health-based system that we have. I think our system is relatively similar to that of like the UK, and I think Australia as well, where the government has a huge amount of funding available for the health initiative, and they do care heavily. It's kind of a socialist style system.
Yeah, well, they're the countries here, the UK. Australia is a bit more privatized, but they are the largest insurer in the country.
Right.
And so they have the incentive to have a healthier population. And that was always really, I should say, the other element of this, which is that we wanted to have an impact at scale. So the idea, one of the things that we would say to represent that, is that we don't want to get one person to run a marathon. We want to get 100,000 people to walk 1,000 more steps a day. And what does that effect look like cumulatively on the healthcare system?
Right, getting people from 0 to 80 rather than from 80 to 99.
Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm. And right now in your position, you're the Chief Partnership Officer, mm-hmm. and as you mentioned earlier, you kind of felt that, the role of business development and that realm definitely gelled well with you. Is there a particular difference between the roles of like sales, business dev, and partnerships? Like people call it so many different things, and some people tell me there is a distinct difference, and some people say no. And I know it sometimes depends on the stage of the company, but how do you distinguish it, if you do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'd be curious to hear what other people said about it. But, for us, partnerships in our organization, and I think it actually can be confusing to the outside. In terms of what my responsibilities are, they are for revenue. So that would be typical sales. They are for advancement, strategic business development. So how do we, grow and partner with other companies that will allow us to move into new markets and new verticals and potentially new products. And then the third piece is client success, which is more tied to the first one with revenue, about how do you have a team that's servicing clients that are paying to use Carrott.
Gotcha.
And so that doesn't necessarily answer the question that you asked. I think the skill sets are largely the same, but how they are applied is very different. Right? So when you think about a sales role, you need to have all the ability to understand a market and where there's opportunity and how to qualify a client, and see where there could be a buyer of your product and a fit, because that's just always going to be an easier and quicker way to close a sale. But you're doing that on, there's more repeatability built into the system. You have something that you're selling, you understand, generally speaking, where the market is, and it's more just about the effort that you're putting in to bring those sales across the line. When I think about business development, it's a little bit more creative, where you're, the product and the understanding of the product, actually, my product background helps on that component of it, which is how can you go and build partnerships that are going to allow you to scale your operation in a way that you wouldn't have to do it yourself. That's what I would say the major difference is. You're looking for net new opportunities for the entire business, as opposed to just selling something that already has that built in.
And I think from my experience, my first job was in business development for a startup media company back in Vancouver, and they're practically.
You didn't mention that.
I didn't. No, yeah. I did not mention that. I rarely tell that to people, but I was cold calling when I was trying to get my first summer internship, and I joined a media company out in the nice Yaletown parts of Vancouver, and they're practically it's a digitized magazine company, and they're trying to make a software where if you click on the magazine picture, it links you back to where you can buy the actual product. And I was in business development, and I did well. I got the most amount of partnerships compared to my peers, but I really hated it just because I just didn't think this was going to go anywhere. And I found that was really.
So you hated the product, or you hated what you were actually doing?
The product, and I think that was the big thing where I still liked talking to a lot of different people constantly, but I just didn't even want to tell them to use this product just because I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. And I found that's a very important thing. Obviously, it's important to every part of the business, but I feel that when you're, especially in the front lines, as part of the revenue generation, that belief, I think, is, for me, materially much more important than if I was in an operational finance role, for example. And I think that's something that I realized when I was going through that role myself.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to, I think I already mentioned this here, but you're never going to be able to sell something that you don't believe in works, right? Or maybe you can, but you don't feel good about it.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing that I've realized over time. It's another thing that I didn't like about advisory services, which is that you don't really pick and choose in advisory services, right? You're more of a gun for hire. So there were some companies or organizations that I worked with when I was in that role that I really enjoyed and really believed in, and there were other ones that I didn't, and that affected my ability to motivate myself to do that work.
Yeah, and I think that's something a lot of people in consulting talk about too, where essentially we have to make the product sound good when we're selling it. And so sometimes I'll make a model, and based on my forecast, I don't think this project will make any money, but we have to make a 15% IRR. So that means, I guess, my input data was wrong. So I have to find better input data.
Yeah. Yeah. That stuff to me can be really soul sucking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. And so for you, if in this kind of partnership business development role, what kind of activity puts you into like a state of flow? That level of just total immersion and engagement, where you just forget to eat, forget to just go to the bathroom, you're just in love with it.
I really enjoy doing the research and prepping for meetings that we have identified where there's a new opportunity. And so, I'll put that in context. We have and will be launching in partnership with the NHS and Public Health England, a Carrott program in that country beginning in January 2019.
It's a huge market.
It's double the size of Canada, and about the size of Nova Scotia. And getting a, having to go and really learn something new and take what we've applied it in a new market, doing that research and then taking all the data and thinking about how you're going to be able to add value and apply it in a place where you have a model that's worked, but you have to kind of tweak it so that it makes sense for the new partners. That puts me into a flow state. It's thinking about and solving really big, complex problems. I find it to be a chess, kind of like a chess game. It's how do you get us as a small, as a really small company, we're 35 people. We have worked with over, in Canada, 30 or 40 different government organizations in the last 2.5 years. So, plotting and mapping out how we got those organizations on board, that really big kind of problem solving stuff, that's the stuff that I love. And
then if you could categorize your activities into kind of buckets, so it's like if we looked at a company and we saw the segments of their revenue, and you could allocate it based on like percentage of time you spend, how would it look? Like, for example, at my previous hedge fund role, I'd say about 50% of my time is on researching, and that's like annual report reading, and then about 30% on management calls, talking to suppliers, customers, etc., and then about 15% is sitting down and just thinking, staring into the zone and trying to ideate my thoughts, and about 5% meetings.
Yeah.
How would you divvy it up? And I know obviously every day or every week could be different, but if you're looking at even a year span, how would it look?
That would be so hard to quantify. And I would say that, especially over a year span, there's some, weeks, I would say at least half my day is in meetings, and it should be. Anybody who's a business development professional who's not out and talking to people in the market should maybe be doing something else. A lot of what you end up doing now is we've scaled. So when we started, there was kind of 4 of us in a shed, getting this going, and I was on my own figuring this out. I now have a team of 6 people that are focused on this. So how to create a high-performing team is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And then I really bucket. There's an amazing book, I don't know if we actually talked about this when I met you, called The Effective Executive.
Yeah, we talked about it.
Peter Drucker. It's a 50-year-old book. And the whole idea about where you're allocating your time to get the biggest impact, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. So, those things really are creating a high-performance team. And then the other side of that is looking at the big strategic buckets that we have that are going to drive the most revenue, but also the most growth potential for Carrott. And then I always have those that I'm trying to allocate my time to. And that's I'm looking at that as something that's going to be a lifelong skill. That's a really hard thing to be able to master, the things that that you say no to.
Yeah, I think it's a phase, and I think as you get to a certain level, you hit a point where now you have to learn to say no to so many different things. Mm-hmm. And I think it plays upon the kind of social perception of how quitting is bad, but quitting is one way of saying no. You have to say no to so many different things to be really good at one thing.
Yeah. With that too, it's you can be good at multiple things. I think you have to be able to define what your objectives are, right? And that might be not being great at one thing. It might be being a mile wide and an inch deep as opposed to the opposite. But really, looking at what kinds of things you want out of a career, what you want out of a life, and defining those, that's something that I feel like putting a lot of mental energy into is ultimately worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is a good good place to kind of do our final kind of wrap up questions that I ask all the guests. If your 20-year-old self were to look at you now, so the Matt of third year in Queens, still in poli-sci, what do you think his emotional reaction would be to where you are right now?
I think he'd think it was pretty cool, to be honest. You know, the one thing that I have now, where I'm at in my career currently, is that, and this has been a new thing, which is that you look at all these component parts of my many different careers and explorations, and at the time they made no sense, and there was a lot of moments where I had a lot of anxiety about, you know, how it was all going to kind of come together and made sense. And that's kind of manifested itself in Carrott. You know, it combines a mobile product background with a government relations or public affairs job, and all those different things are combine a lot of different learnings that have made me, you know, good in the role that I'm in now. And I would say that wasn't always the case, being able to see what that looked like. But I always knew that, you know, in terms of things that a third year university me wanted, was to go travel, to go see the world, which I did. And, you know, I'd always had an interest in being an entrepreneur. As a kid, I had the lemonade stand. I started a mail order business when I was 13. I'd always was really interested in business, and appreciated that I actually expanded that scope in my university education and doing things that are different, because I feel like they actually make me better at business.
And is there then any advice that you'd give to that 20-year-old Matt that you wish you had gotten?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, don't, especially when you're young, don't stay in your lane. You know, it's going to be a lot harder, especially, you know, if you are surrounded by, which I'm sure most of your listeners are, ambitious, successful friends. You're going to see people that pass you at various stages and seem like they have an idea about what they want to be doing, and it's really clear. And, you know, no one really does, is the other, you know, the reality of the situation. And so it's just, you know, continue to be as curious as you can, and really think about what you like to do. That's the other thing that I would say, which is that, and it would be the advice that I would give myself thought I wanted to go be a diplomat. You know, it's, what do you like to do on a day-to-day basis? And figuring out what that is should help to inform what career decisions you're looking at, as opposed to thinking about what you think you should be doing.
Actually looking at how the time is spent. Right?
Exactly. And being able to quantify it like you did, which I obviously couldn't.
You could start now too.
I have to think about it more.
Yeah. No, this was a really fun chat, and I really appreciate you giving me the time to, you know, really learn more about your story and also share it with our listeners.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot, man.
Thanks.
So thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please check out other episodes, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date for the future episodes. Also, I would really appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, whichever is applicable to you. To see past episodes, you can go to oldmandan.com/podcasts. Also, you can sign up to my weekly newsletter on my blog, oldmandan.com/newsletter. You can stay up to date with future podcast episodes that way, and included in the newsletter are my book reviews I write, my weekly article related to the domain of self-development systems, as well as 7 things I learned throughout the week on being healthy, wealthy, and wise. Finally, special thanks to icons8.com for allowing me to use their music, Tiny People, on the podcast. Great. I will see you all next time. Take care.